things in order. We started the YouTube live, everything's working.
Okay.
And we should wait for people to join.
True. I think we'll just wait like for another 2 to 5 minutes to have people join, and then we'll
Yes.
we'll just wait like for people to come in.
Okay, so we're gonna start now. Okay, great. Everyone's here. So hello and welcome everyone. We're very happy to welcome you all to our YouTube Live Q&A session, where we will talk about democracy in Indonesia. So especially in connection with the new criminal code, which was approved by Indonesia's government in mid-December and the upcoming presidential elections in 2024. So that's why we invited our friends from What Is Up Indonesia, and they will kind of function as our experts and give us a better insight into the current political atmosphere in Indonesia. So now we're very happy to welcome Hersey and Abby, who are with us today. Thank you guys for joining and taking the time to do this YouTube Live together. We're very grateful for that. And yeah, so we received a lot of questions concerning democracy in Indonesia. And so we're really excited to get some answers or opinions from you guys today.
Yeah, and before we start our Q&A session, it would be nice if you could just quickly introduce yourself and explain what Is Up Indonesia actually is and what you guys are doing. So yeah.
Okay, I can start. So hi everyone, thank you for inviting Vivi. We are very excited to have a little chat with you guys about Indonesia and its pretty crazy democracy. My name is Abigail, but you can call me Abby for short. I'm the co-founder of What Is Up Indonesia, or for short, WeWe. So day to day, I basically run WeWe from content creating, which involves researching, writing, meme making, designing, all that stuff. And what is WeWe? For those of you who are still quite confused, WeWe is essentially an independent media based in social media, mainly in Instagram and Twitter, where we summarize and translate Indonesian social politics into bite-sized English posts. And we use pop culture and memes as a reference, as comedy, to try and ease people, to make politics less intimidating and to make it more understandable for our audience who speaks in English.
And I'm Hersey. I also am a part of What Is Up Indonesia, aka WeWe. I am its editor-in-chief. And I recently graduated as well from a degree in area studies. So it's good to be speaking with other people from area studies. And yeah, on the day-to-day, I edit a lot of posts. I write some content as well for WeWe. And both Abby and I are on the scan for the recent trends and what's on the news in Indonesia. So yeah, we're really excited to have the discussion with you guys.
Again, thank you so much for taking the time. We also just want to introduce ourselves real quick for the people who don't know what SOA or Project Southeast Asia is. We are a student group from the University of Passau who focuses on the Southeast Asian culture, and we organize cultural events and also political discussions, and our goal is just in general to bring the Southeast Asian culture to our campus. Okay, so for the beginning, we have some general questions for you, and afterwards we go into the topics of the new presidential election in 2024 and also the new criminal codes. And one more thing before we actually start, if there are any questions you don't feel comfortable in answering, just tell us or skip the question. All right, so for the first couple of questions, we want to know how does politics and democracy affect the people's life in Indonesia? Do you think that democracy is like impartial or only owned by the elites? And also on a personal note, like what is democracy for you? What does it mean for Indonesia and its people?
Abby, you can start us off. I think, yeah, Abby, you can start us off.
I was about to say, since Hersey is our editor-in-chief, I would really love to hear you go first.
Okay, sure. I'll answer the last part of your question because your question was, how does democracy impact the lives of Indonesians and its people? I'd actually like to hear that response from Abby because I don't actually live in Indonesia, so perhaps I have an external perspective. But I think your last question there about what does democracy mean to me personally, and also what does it mean to its people, I think is a really interesting question. So democracy for some people, it's democracy has two definitions depending on some people. For many, it's just procedural and electoral. So if a country has elections, then therefore it qualifies to be democracy. But then for another group of political scientists, that's not quite enough. You need to have civil rights, you need to have rule of law, you need to have protection of freedoms, et cetera, et cetera. And I think for a lot of Indonesians, they see democracy as the former, right? So for a lot of Indonesian citizens themselves, if you ask them, is Indonesia democracy? They'll say, well, of course, we're having elections in 2024. We voted in President Jokowi. We were the ones who voted, and therefore they'll say it's a democracy. But if you ask many experts and academics in Indonesian studies, they'll say, well, actually, you've got a lot of repression of opposition. You've got a system wherein money is exploited and used for electoral gains. They wouldn't question the fact that it's a democracy because it has elections, but they'd say it's very imperfect as a democracy, right? So I think Indonesia is in a unique situation where you have a disconnect between people's perceptions of the quality of democracy and what the reality is regarding Indonesia's quality of democracy, wherein you have a citizenry that, they believe that they live in a democracy and they're all right with democracy, but actually they don't realize that the level of democracy in Indonesia and its quality is actually quite low by international standards.
Mhm. Yeah, going off to what Terzi said, I think we need to remember democracy and how it impacted people's lives, especially like everyday people's lives, by remembering Indonesia's history, which means the New Order. I don't, if you guys are aware, so Indonesia experienced a sort of authoritarian period. We called it the New Order, and during that time, democracy basically did not exist, and then we transitioned from that to democracy. So democracy in Indonesia, despite its very, very still quite low score, is still quite new too. And so I think a lot of people, especially like those who are everyday folks who did not have time to actually like study and like research deep, they're mentally they're not there yet in terms of democracy. So it's like in the middle of like a lot of transition. And we need to also remember that Indonesia is very diverse, meaning that education level is very, very diverse, meaning that we have some very, very educated folks who are very aware of our history and the current political landscape. And we have those who don't even have access to the internet. And if you don't have access to the internet, you don't have access to information. Some of them, I bet, don't even know what democracy is to a certain extent. And so with that level of diversity, and then with remembering the history, there's this transition to democracy brings about like very, very different responses. I have one story from my dad. So my dad experienced the New Order regime. And so he saw me doing What Is Up Indonesia, basically bringing political awareness to like my peers. And he was like very amazed. Like for us, maybe like educating people or bringing political awareness is like an everyday thing, right? But for my dad, even though he's highly educated, for him, he told me that, oh, wow, it never clicked or dawned on me that it is important to be politically aware, because now we have a democracy where our knowledge can impact our decision, and our decision can impact how we vote, and how we vote can impact the country and the nation, right? Because he lived throughout the New Order, and for him, mentally, being politically aware is not that important because you can't really do anything about it anyway. So there's that kind of mentality. And then for people who are not used to exercising their freedom in a democracy, it can get very confusing. I know I've heard a lot of stories from folks during elections. So we have legislative elections too. And since we have so many parties, we have so many candidates, and they're so confused. And for them, it's like, why do I need to like choose? This is like such a burden for me. And they end up just choosing whoever looks whoever is the prettiest or looks like the the handsomest. Yeah, I'll just like I choose him because he looks cool and handsome. So it's and then you have those who are pre-educated who understands that your choices impact how the country basically go, or how politics and the decision that you make impacts like the country. Sometimes they are very frustrated. There's a lot of frustration because since the majority are still pretty unaware, whatever they choose impacted the minority elites, maybe, who are pre-educated. So there's a lot of tension in that. And then, as Herzi said, our democracy is not perfect, and that imperfection, I saw a lot of people mistaken that imperfection as, oh, democracy is not working at all. Maybe we should go back to like the previous period. So there's just so many different things.
Okay. But would you say that the older generation, or the generation who experienced the new order, supports the younger generation in their political activism, and also the process or their goal for political awareness?
I think that's an interesting question. I guess it's a question of who, Abby just talked about the fact that Indonesia is very diverse, right? So when we talk about the older generation, it's like who in the older generation. But I think a fact is youth in Indonesia have always played a very important role. Youth were the ones who were able to fight for independence against the Dutch. Youth were the ones who were first put in charge under Sukarno's government. Youth were the ones who overthrew the new order in 1998, right? So they've always played an important role. But actually, as the youth of Indonesia who have played important political roles have grown up, they've become part of the system, and they end up losing that idealism. So actually, there was a lot of hope for the generation of activists in 1998 who was able to bring down Suharto, the dictator. But now there's a lot of disappointment in that generation because they ended up just going into parliament, doing the same corrupt things as what the older generation did before. So I think part of the apathy and the frustration that Abigail was talking about, it's also the fact that the older generation is perceived as just doing lip service. In all the official speeches, they'd say youth are so important, we support you guys, but then at the back they're still doing all the policies that negatively affect youth, such as deforestation, not caring enough about the environment, stripping back labor rights. So I think part of the apathy and frustration that's felt by a lot of Indonesians, particularly the youth, can be boiled down to that sense of disappointment and betrayal that they feel towards the older generation, who frequently say that they're supportive, but whose actions actually, who never really walk the walk.
Yeah, and I think we should also remember how culture plays a part in how this is translated. And as Herzi said, like a lot of political figures or like the older generation campaigns or publicly said that, oh, the youth of Indonesia needs to be more politically aware. They're pre-apathetic. They need to be more involved. They need to speak out and innovate and be creative. But then at the same time, in our culture, when the older generation are usually challenged or criticized, they don't really like it, because we have like a very honor-based culture in which you need to honor your elder. And so there's a survey by the British Council, and actually shows that a lot of Indonesian, the youth of Indonesian, when they want to be politically involved or speak out, but then when there's like an intergenerational debate or conversation, they feel like their voices are not being heard, or they feel like they're being silenced even. So I think the older generation's attitude towards wanting the younger generation to be more politically aware and involved is that, yes, you need to be politically aware, but to a certain extent that you don't hurt our ego or our authority. So that's kind of like the general sentiment. So there's a lot of confusion, like, should I voice out my opinion? Should I be politically involved, or should I just stay back and not care, and so it's there's this two tension.
While we're talking about like expressing your political opinion, I have another question here, which is, are individuals free to express their personal views on political or other sensitive topics without fear of surveillance and retribution? So like, how free is it to actually talk about your opinion, and can there be troubles following it?
Well, I think on a legislative level, it is, even on a legislative level, there are laws that inhibits or restrict the quote unquote personal expression, or even especially political expression. Like, you're now allowed to insult like the president or the head of state, or like government institutions. And the definition of insulting is very ambiguous, so it's very multi-interpretive. So you can either, some people or some government or those who have enacted this law have interpreted insult to no criticism, and the court has actually allowed some of it. And I forgot, what is it in English?
The electronic information and transactions law.
Right, yeah. So there's that law. It's pretty infamous here in Indonesia. And without fear of surveillance or retribution, even if you escape the law and you've been very cautious and being very smart with how you criticize, there's been a lot of instances where activists and journalists were hacked mysteriously, and where their personal information are doxed online. And those information and those hacking are like, it's very obvious that it's done by someone in the high places, so, sort of speaking. So there's the law that created this chill effect because it's multi-interpretive and it's not clear. And then there's experiences of being of surveillance and hacking and doxing. So I think individuals are not that free to express their personal views, especially political views there.
I have a bit of an opposing opinion. I guess it's not really opposing, but just adding some nuance on there. I think generally, if you look at Freedom House, Indonesia is labeled as partly free, and I think there's a reason for that. I think that you can still express your opinion to an extent without any fear of repercussion. I think it's possible. It's not completely impossible.
To a certain extent.
To an extent, there's a very thin line that you can't cross, and there's a certain level of criticism until which it is allowed. After which you'll face repercussions, right? So technically and constitutionally, your freedom of speech is allowed, but there have been, for example, an increased number of cases in which political opposition has been silenced through means like Abigail mentioned, such as doxing, such as buzzers, which are more covert, so they're not very obviously from the government, but also more overt, so for example, from the use of laws such as the blasphemy law, such as the new criminal code, such as the electronic information and transactions law. So those laws have existed for a very, very long time. It's just recently that they've started to get used against political opposition, right? So I think it's not really, it's free and everyone's scared. I think now a substantial percentage of people do say, if you survey them, do you feel free to express your opinions? A lot of them will say, no, I actually feel a bit scared. But that's quite a recent phenomenon, I'd say, in the last, not even 5 years, maybe 3 years, 4 years. And that can be attributed to the government feeling more comfortable with using the existing legislation to their advantage against political opponents. Yeah, it's a slow downfall, but not yet doomsday, I'd say.
So what do you say regarding, oh, sorry, do you want to say something, Abby?
No.
Okay, so in that context, with media, would you say media is independent, or is there also a change observed? Like, is it becoming more state-owned? do they influence or censor it?
So I think media, like the mass media in Indonesia, most of the big mass media, like the newspaper and national television channel, they are not state-owned. We have like, I think one or two like state-owned television channel, but it's not the biggest. However, in those big mass media companies, there's a lot of political conflict of interest if you actually trace like who they work with or who owns the media and stuff like that. So to say that it's the media are independent because it's not state owned, I don't think it's that correct, because it's not that independent, since they all have like their political agenda, so to speak. Almost all. Is it fair to say?
Yeah.
The majority would have. And I think that's why there's a high distrust among the people with the mass media here. And that's why I think there's a rise in independent media such as WeWe, and there are other accounts that are pretty like independent journalism, stuff like that. It is because there's a growing distrust among the people for the mass media.
I'd reiterate the fact that I don't think the media can be said, I don't think you can describe the media as independent, but I don't think that's because of political interference. It's not because of direct intervention or interference by the government. It's what Abigail said. There's a lot of, so the media landscape in Indonesia is basically an oligopoly. There are a lot of big conglomerates and big names that control a lot of media companies, most of whom have political interests, like Abigail mentioned. So for example, the Trans Empire is owned by, is that the Tanus or is that the Tanjungs?
Oh, it's
Abigail,
it's probably the Tanjungs, and then the Tanus is MNC.
MNC, and they have a party.
Yeah.
So MNC,
Yeah.
they've got a party, Perindo, which is polling really well at the moment. So the Trans Empire, Tanjung, their daughter is currently a special
Staff of the president.
of the president. And Surya Paloh, I think he's in media as well, who's the owner of the National Democratic Party. So they all have political interests. All those businesses, I mean, if you're a business, obviously, if you want to survive and you want to thrive in a country like Indonesia,
Exactly, yeah.
you have to get involved in politics. So it's not necessarily the government directly censoring or interfering with the editorial boards of the newsletters or the newsrooms. That's not the case. It's the fact that the owners of the media companies are so intertwined with political interests that they're just bound to be biased and to not really be objective in their reporting of politics, I think is a good way to summarize the situation.
So maybe for a closing question before we move on to our another topic, like how do young people voice and practice like their democracy, especially in social media? And how would you say, do you face any difficulties with WeWe regarding like this kind of censorship? Do you have problems or like fears in your work?
Do you have fears, Hirsch? No, he's chill.
I'm in another country, so I'm yeah.
I think for young people, right, and in social media, I think a lot of young people do the same thing that we're doing, like in WeWe. So they make a lot of like they're speaking out, trying to educate their fellow their friends, the people that they're of their followers, and then a lot of them also like do creative means, like meme making and skits, and there's just like abundance of like contents in social media of young people trying to like educate and bring awareness, and especially there's this phenomenon. I think it's still quite relevant, but it was pretty big like couple of last year, I think. And some people coin it as like the viral based justice, where basically because a lot of people deem that the Indonesian criminal justice system is still very, very flawed. And a lot of people don't get like their justice. If, for example, if they report to the police, they need to pay in order for the police to like actually process their case. So a lot of people report it on Twitter and ask a lot of people to like make the case viral. And once the case is viral, usually the authority will take a look at it and like conduct further investigation to either gain popularity, credibility, or like gain favors with the people. And usually like political figure would jump in and say like, oh yeah, I'm gonna ask the police to like really take this investigation seriously because now all eyes are watching them. So it's very sad, honestly, but that's how the young people of Indonesia have utilized social media to gain justice, to express their frustration creatively, to avoid like those laws. Yeah.
I think I'll answer a bit about your question about whether we feel scared or not. And I think this one's a bit interesting. So to an extent, there is a fear of criticizing the government to an extent. We're more objective, or we try to be neutral in our tone. So that's not really an issue for us. But I think the issues that we're more scared of is not really the government, but something to realize is that Indonesia's political environment recently has been quite polarized. So we're actually afraid of attacks from a certain side of politics rather than the government itself. So when we post on issues, for example, that are talking about religion, talking about a specific organization, we're scared of a certain side of politics that might raid our comment section. So I think scared of the government, yes, but I think in the polarized environment and within the context of very very strong groups, strongly opinionated groups, often you find that you're scared of offending a side, and the consequences of offending a side, I think, is something that we're scared of as well. Would you agree, Abby?
I mean, I'm not okay. I think personally, I'm not afraid of being attacked online in the sense like our comment section being raided by them or something like that. I'm only scared if they enacted or if they like reported us to the figure of authority and use the legislation for us, because like those legislation that we mentioned earlier, those are called delik aduan, meaning it will only be processed if somebody submitted a report. And so anyone can submit a report, right? So I'm only scared if they do that. But to minimize that, we've actually put a lot of like precaution in how we talk about certain things and how we post in WeWe, that I think I can safely say that we're on the safe side, because like we always put a disclaimer, like don't trust us guys, we can be wrong, stuff like that. Like that will help us if worse comes to worse, like the worst thing happened. But if it's only like bullying online or comments being raided, I think I'm not really scared of that. Maybe like if my phone got hacked, I'll be pretty scared. But I don't think we ever post something that's very provocative, to be honest, because we're very careful on that. And also another thing is, of course, we post everything, we write everything in full English, and so that puts a lot of like barrier from a lot of different groups that do not speak English, perhaps. So I think that's why I'm scared, but not as scared. Or maybe I'm just ignorant now.
Neither of us,
maybe.
Neither Abigail or I are zooming to you guys from prison. So I think so far we're on the right track in terms of the precautions that we're taking.
There we go.
Okay, so thank you already for answering these kind of more general questions about democracy in Indonesia. We're going to be now moving on to another main topic, which is the presidential election next year in 2024. So we've collected different questions that either we have had that we're interested about or that other people have asked us in the Google form that we uploaded. And so the first question, kind of generally about the presidential election, is like, what does the election system look like? So how are candidates, how will they be selected for the election, and how does the process work? Can you explain a little bit about that?
Okay, yeah, sure. So Indonesia is a presidential system, so it's quite different from Germany's, where it's more of a parliamentary system based on proportional representation, if I'm not wrong. Yeah.
Correct.
So yeah, it's a presidential system, which means that the president is actually outside of the legislature. In saying that, though, the parties are quite powerful. So in order to nominate, well, a president, a candidate has to gain a nomination from a party. You don't really get independent presidential candidates. It's not a thing here because they have to get nominated from a party. In order for a party to be able to nominate, they have to control 15%, 15 or 20% of seats in the legislature. Please fact check me. I think it's 15 or 20%. And if a party can't, or if a party doesn't have 15 to 20% of the legislature, they have to get a coalition of parties that does control at least 15 or 20% of the seats. So currently, the only party that's big enough to independently forward a candidate, I think, is Jokowi's party, the current president's party, which is the Indonesian Democratic Party of Struggle, is its English name. They're the only party right now that can submit a candidate by itself. So right now, the political gossip all across Indonesia is who's going to be teaming up with who. There are a couple of coalitions that have already indicated that they'll form together, but nothing is yet set in stone. So basically, it's up to the parties to choose who they'll be putting forward for. And in saying that, though, the party system in Indonesia is very flexible. There's not much ideology in there. So it's very easy for a candidate to move parties if they don't get support from their current party, for example. And indications are that that will be happening for a number of potential candidates. And that has already happened. For example, the governor of West Java, he became governor under the support of one party. Now he's joined another party, Golkar, which is another pretty big party. Yeah, there'll be a lot of switching and swapping and deals going on behind the scenes as we talk.
Okay, and how many parties are there in general in Indonesia, or like what are parties or candidates that are relevant for the upcoming election we should focus on or have a closer look on?
So parties, they're in contention for 2024 election alone. There are 23. And so there's definitely way more that are not in contention. That are like smaller or did not pass the verification process. And yeah, like Hersey said, usually it's very difficult to tell them apart because parties in Indonesia, they're not really ideologically based, but they're more authority based, meaning that they revolves around their leader or their the leader of the party. And the political ideological landscape in Indonesia, I would say, and this is probably like a very oversimplification. It's very different for example, like there's like a clear left and right like side, but in Indonesia, because our history again, like there's no left leaning parties, because and usually parties, if you wanna like map out their ideology, it's either they're more religious based, meaning like Islamic based, or they're more Pancasila based, meaning like nationalistic. They're more nationalistic in that sense. But everyone's pretty much like kind of in the middle, so it's pretty difficult to like tell them apart.
Okay, interesting. This kind of Hersey, did you want to say something?
Go ahead. No, go
ahead. This kind of ties into the next question that we had, which is there a strong connection between politics and religion? So Abby, you already mentioned that there are like some parties that are more, focused on religion. And so can one of you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Yeah, like Abigail mentioned, the traditional way you'd classify parties in Indonesia isn't left or right, but Islamist or Islamic versus nationalist. But I think a lot of the literature about party politics, there's an expert called Dirk Tomsa who writes a lot about political parties in Indonesia, and his observation is that most of the Islamic parties in Indonesia, they're only Islamic by name, right? So they're the same thing about having just a really important figurehead, and it just being a funnel for the exchange of people and the exchange of money. But you know, they will campaign for politics, like greater enforcement of Islamic law, for example. They will say that, but then in terms of how they act, it doesn't really work that way. The only party that I'd say is actually ideologically Islamic is called the Prosperous Justice Party. You asked about parties to look out for in the next election. I think there'll be a very interesting party to look out for because they've always played an oppositional role, and Indonesia is famous for very big governing coalitions. Right now, Jokowi holds 80% is his coalition, but I think the main opposition to the Jokowi government has been from the Prosperous Justice Party, from a very Islamic standpoint, and they're very conservative, right? And I'd say they're the only ideological party in parliament right now. One of two ideological parties competing, one of which is not in parliament. To answer your question, religion does definitely play a part. Doesn't mean, does religion play a part through political parties? Not necessarily. Usually it's from civil society movements. There are two massive the biggest Islamic organization in the world is in Indonesia. It's called Nahdlatul Ulama, NU for short. They exert massive amounts of pressure on the government. They're more moderate, so they're the nice guys depending on who you talk to. Same with an organization called Muhammadiyah, but there's also smaller, more radical organizations that also exert influence to the government, many of which have actually been banned in the past few years. So I think, yes, Islam does play a big part in politics, but not necessarily from political parties. A lot of the influence that Islam plays towards politics is actually from civil society organizations and Islamic organizations from the grassroots.
Okay, so just to clear it up, you wouldn't say that religion plays, or the Islam will play an important role in the election, or
I think it definitely will. I think it definitely will. It definitely will. I'm just saying I'm just questioning where the source of that will be, right? I don't think it'll be the elites that actually there was a survey done that showed that the elites aren't actually that Islamic in terms of their values. Just a bit of talk. So it's not going to come from them. They're not going to be the ones who are going to push for it. If they do push for it, it's going to be because they face pressure from the people they're trying to win votes from.
Yeah.
Right.
So I think a good rule of thumb is that will religion has an impact on politics, it will on areas that is dependent on popularity. But in areas that will not be dependent on popularity, I don't think it will. In general, this is of course like overgeneralizing, right? So the things that involve popularity are usually like, of course, election, and then how will the state allocate their budget? There's a lot of debate about that too. In public policy, smear campaigns, I think religion will definitely play a big part in those stuff.
Just adding to that really quickly as well, if you compare the 2024 elections to the 2019 elections in trying to answer the question, will religion be involved? In 2019, religion was very heavily, it played a very big role in the campaign. So, for example, you had Jokowi's side saying that if Prabowo were to win, they'd try to implement a caliphate system. You know, you'd have smear campaigns like that, and then you'd have people from Prabowo's side saying Jokowi's a fake Muslim, he's actually Chinese and has a communist background. And Jokowi was so threatened by that he chose the most famous and senior Indonesian Muslim cleric to be his vice presidential running candidate, right? So religion had a very big impact on the 2019 elections, which is why I think that it'll have a big impact on the 2024 elections. But I think less so because indications now are it's going to be 3 candidates minimal. So I think last time polarization based on religion was very easy because there were 2 candidates. So it's very easy for one side to attack the other, accuse them to be radicals, accuse them to be non-religious, etc. But I think when there are more candidates in the game, that sort of lessens the chance of that happening. But nevertheless, I think religion will still always play a part in Indonesian politics just because of the history.
While we're already talking about presidential candidates, we have a question from the YouTube Live that was posted in the chat, which is, how powerful does a person have to be to become a candidate? How much money does one have to spend on a campaign to have chances to be elected as president?
Well, I mean, if you need to be supported by a party, usually that indirectly indicates that you kind of need to be amongst the elite to kind of already be in that inner circle. And I'm not sure, I'm pretty sure there has been like reports or like research that estimated how much you need to like run as a president campaign wise. I'm sure it's huge, but like the only thing that is like I remember on top of my head, one of the Secretary General from the biggest party, the PDIP, the Jokowi's party, he said that for a candidate of a legislative election, so that means the House representative, like a candidate may spend a minimum of 5 billion rupiah, and that's like around 330,000 US dollars for a campaign. And so, and then I know like for the governor, there's like a certain amount, and I'm pretty sure like as you go up the ladder, it'll become more and more expensive.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I think it's very expensive, and therefore like a lot of our our House representative, or even like our candidates for presidential candidates usually have businesses or is an entrepreneur, quote unquote, in certain sense, usually, or have like a large backing because they need like a lot of money to campaign.
Yeah,
I find that first part of the question really interesting. So how powerful do you need to be as an individual? Previously, you needed to have a lot of power. So if you needed to either come from the military or a very influential family background to have a lot of money. And if you look at the history of Indonesian presidents, Sukarno was a Javanese noble and an independence fighter. The president after him, Suharto, was a military general. After him, Habibie, he was a business person, very well known, very elite. After him, he came from a very long line, Abdurrahman Wahid, a very long line of respective Islamic scholars, the biggest family of Islamic scholars. After him, it was the daughter of Sukarno, massive family. And then after him, it was another military person, SBY. Jokowi's presidency, Jokowi is the first person not from an elite background to take the presidency. And I think that's why a lot of people are optimistic. And I think now, looking at who might potentially be candidates, I think it's true to say that you don't need as much power as you did before. You don't really have to come from a military background. You don't really have to have that much money. But it is true that you need support and you need the backing of very powerful elites. So for example, a lot of the people who are mentioned as potential candidates, they're just normal, well, upper middle class to upper class people who rose the ranks of politics and became regional leaders. So they started off as mayors, they started off as governors, and they built their fame and their political capital through that. Through that, they gained the attention of very big boys in politics, through the big parties, gained their support, and that's how they're able to become political sort of candidates for the presidential race, right? So whereas in Indonesia, historically, it was about you having the most power in terms of charisma, family background, wealth. Now it's about securing that power from the party owners. So you have popularity from your governorship, from your, role in local governance. You have that as your leverage. Now you just need to secure the wealth and the support of those higher up in the party.
Okay. So you have mentioned Jokowi several times. You're the current president of Indonesia. Do you think he has another chance to be re-elected, or will he even run for another presidency?
Yeah, this has been very controversial in Indonesia for a very long time. Constitutionally, he's not allowed. So the constitution allows only 2 terms of 5 years, and this is Jokowi's approaching the end of his second term. However, many people, especially supporters of his, mentioned that they wanted to amend the constitution so that he could be given a 3rd term. You know, they mentioned that they'd support him for a 3rd term, because, you know, they don't want to lose their power, right? They've gone this far, they don't want to lose their power. That's all been categorically denied by Jokowi. So I think the chances of a 3rd Jokowi term is slim, but I think never say never is the golden rule of politics. So it's not a categorical no from me yet.
Yeah.
Okay, there was one particular question as well from somebody, and she asked, what is the story behind the candidate of the PDIP, and can her family background be considered as problematic for the democracy of Indonesia, and what is her political strategy in general?
I think it's important to remember that the PDIP, that the biggest political party, hasn't put forth like a candidate. So we still aren't sure who they're gonna like support. So I'm not sure like which candidate this question is talking about. I can guess, but I don't want to assume, because that can be misconstrued for something quite dangerous or wrong. Because again, like, they haven't put forth like the candidate that they're gonna support.
I do think
But
so. Since I have
you-
I'm a bit more relaxed since I'm from another country, but I think
okay, then Hersey will answer it.
Go for
I'm
it.
still going to be quite careful because she comes from a very she comes from a family. Well, this will go. That's right. Her mum was a president. Her grandpa was a president, right? So she comes from a very powerful family of ex-presidents. However, how does that affect the chances? I think not many people like her in Indonesia, but I think the family thing is definitely quite powerful. Like Abigail mentioned very early on, Indonesia's culture is very hierarchical, and it's very much based on parents and family. So for a lot of lower to middle class, average Indonesians, that family backing might actually be a plus. And I think it's important to look comparatively as well. This isn't only a thing in Indonesia, it's a thing across Asia. You have the Marcoses in Philippines who are now in power. In Myanmar, Aung San Suu Kyi is the daughter of an independence fighter. You know, and in Korea as well, you know, Park Geun-hye, who was impeached, was the daughter of, you know, Korea's longest lasting dictator. So I think in Asian cultures in general, you know, here it's, you know, in the West, it's very easy. Nepotism, it's very negative. But I think if you look at the family structures and the culture of family in Asia, for a lot of people, that strong and prestigious family background can actually be a plus, and can actually win votes. So that's just something to consider as well.
Okay. So to close that part as well, would you say with the new president coming up, will there be a huge shift in the democratic atmosphere in Indonesia? So will it be more transparent and stable, or will it completely like change? Like, can you even predict something about it from that point now?
I'd love to hear Abby's thoughts on this. Or do you want me to go first? I feel like I've done a lot of speaking.
I think you should go first.
I'll try to channel my.
Because you're
What?
safer, right?
Okay.
I mean, we can also skip the question.
No, it's okay.
Yeah, it's
I'll
fine.
try to channel my inner Nostradamus. Will the political atmosphere change? I think it will to an extent. I think that factor of whether there'll be 2 candidates or 3 candidates, I think will be very important in how Indonesian politics, because for the past decade, it's only been 2 candidates and the same 2 candidates, right? So it's just, there hasn't really been a shift in vision there hasn't really been any innovative new sort of concepts and policies that have entered the ring. So I think I am optimistic that there will be some change, because it's a new generation of up and coming, politicians who made their mark after reformasi, so after democratization. Right, so I'm looking forward to those new visions, new values, and new policy ideas that they'll bring forth, because for the past decade, we've just had more of the same thing. In saying that, though, do I think the fundamental structures of Indonesian politics, such as discrimination, such as corruption, ethnic tension, religious tension, will change? I don't think so. I think they're just very intrinsic structural parts of Indonesian politics that I think will need more radical, transformative leadership to change. And I don't see any candidate providing that at the moment. So while I am optimistic for sort of a new, fresh vision or direction, I think the more fundamental aspects of Indonesian politics, such as corruption, that are so embedded deeply into the system, I think will still stick around for quite a while.
Okay. So to move on to our last subtopic, we want to talk about the new regulation, which was approved mid-December. So it was quite an uproar, not just in Indonesia, but kind of in the whole world. There was a lot of media coverage about it. How did or still does this new regulation affect the democracy, or also like the everyday life kind of the Indonesian people? Like, does it have an impact already, or yeah?
So the new criminal code that was ratified, it will not come into effect until the next 3 years. So we have like this transition period from the previous criminal code to the new one. So during this transitional period, some people said that the several civil organizations are trying to do some judicial review on some of the articles. But once the new criminal code is enacted, there will be definitely certain changes, but to what extent and how quickly, I think I'm not so sure, because if we look at the articles of the new criminal code, there's a lot of problematic articles in terms of like invasion of privacy and like erosion of freedom of speech, and even democracy, some might argue. But sometimes, but a lot of those are actually like the previous articles that we mentioned are delik aduan, meaning it will not be processed unless somebody reports it. It goes with like what the Western media likes to call the Bali sex ban, or like, oh, Indonesians can't do like premarital sex anymore. Like there is such article that ban premarital sex, meaning like sex that is outside of a marriage, but it will only be processed if a family member, meaning parents, child, or spouse, like official spouse, reports it to the police. And if they change their mind, they can take it back anytime. So I actually really hate to say this, but I will say it just to be fair. Considering that the controversial criminal code has been changed since the first time it provoked like a huge demonstration in 2019, that article on like, there are certain tweaks that I think are actually a pretty good middle ground, and there are pretty good middle ground between like the conservative and between like a lot of the different agendas that people wanted to put in that criminal code. So for example, the one about premarital sex, the main argument that the quote unquote conservative group argued for that article is that, oh, like, do you want your child to like have free sex everywhere? And like, are you happy if you see like your daughter or your son get STD or like have, you know, all that kind of argument. So I think what they did is they compromised by saying, okay, we'll still have this article, but it can only be enacted if a parent, child, or spouse reported it. So I think there's actually a lot of like good compromises that satisfied, quote unquote, like more parties. But again, like essentially at its essence, I think it's still problematic. And again, like how fast and how drastically will it impact Indonesia? It's a very difficult question because it is another question of implementation in which we know that, like Hersey mentioned, you know, like the articles and legislation that may prevent criticism towards the government, for example, has been there for a long time, but it's only recently that it's been used. So in the new criminal code, I would say that we will have a lot of like potentially problematic new articles, but it's just like we're not sure how it will be used or how drastically or how immensely it will be used. So it'll depend on that. And I'm afraid that maybe how that will happen will depend on like the political agenda or like the political climate that will happen during those years or during like certain period of time. So yeah, I think that's from me.
Yeah, so you talked about how maybe it was a little bit of a compromise of things of like the different groups of people kind of wanted, and that was put in there. And so how was or still is the public reaction in Indonesia to the new criminal code? Like how did the public kind of receive it?
Generally, I think there was a huge uproar and a lot of people hate it. They don't like it, but I'm not sure if the reason that they're hating it is actually like the reason why the new criminal code is problematic. Because for example, like actually during the 2019 huge demonstration, one of the biggest ever since the new order by students, a lot of the students actually who went there are not aware of what they were demonstrating against. Like just for example, I know one of my friend who joined and she had no idea like why she was there. Her and her friends were just there to have fun and to find potential boyfriend. But honestly, like there's a lot of that, and I think there's a couple of research that has like they interviewed and stuff. But of course, I'm not saying like all of them, but I think there's a good part of like that demonstration that people are there just because it's cool and not because they really know why. And so I think a lot of the public anger that are happening due to the criminal code, they're just angry because maybe their friends are angry, or maybe they saw that their favorite activist group are angry. But when you ask a lot of them, like, why do you not like this criminal code? Like a lot of them are probably not sure. So, but it doesn't mean that their dislike or their anger are not valid. It's just that we need to question, like, if we really want to question, like, oh, do the people of Indonesia really agree or disagree with this new criminal code? And we judge it based on their anger and their rejection of this new ratification. I don't think it's an accurate indicator because we don't know like why they are rejecting it, kind of.
To add to that, if you compare the 2019 protests to recently, I think in 2019, a lot of people were angry. There were, like Abigail mentioned, people who were there just for fun and they didn't really know what they were protesting, but those were organized by really big organizations and student organizations. And I think one of the reasons why they protested so actively and so passionately in 2019, but you didn't really see those protests when the criminal code was actually revised and ratified, was because the government was very successful in framing the media coverage on these new revisions as about morality and sexuality. in 2019, the students were protesting, we want freedom of speech, we want to be able to criticize, we want democracy. But then when the government frames the issue as about sex and about contraception and about morality, it's suddenly hard for the students to go out there and protest, because then they'll just look like, I don't want to use the word horny, but horny. That's and I think that was very clever strategy. And something to mention as well is, like Abigail mentioned, it's really difficult to judge what the Indonesian public feels about this law, because it's so diverse. A lot of people, they know about conservative Islam, but actually a lot of Indonesians who aren't Muslims are also very conservative. So you have, for example, a lot of Christians who'd also oppose homosexuality and sex before marriage. You'd have a lot of Hindus in Bali who'd say the same thing. You'd have a lot of Buddhists who are Chinese who'd say the same thing. So I think it's a question of course, Islamic conservatism has played a large role in the criminal code, but I think it's an important fact to mention that just Indonesian society is quite conservative religiously, especially the older generations. So it is very difficult to judge what general perceptions are about the law.
And I think what makes it even more confusing is we need to remember that the new criminal code has so many different articles that represent so many different agenda. That makes like just rejecting it fully or accepting it fully is nearly impossible. Like, for example, we get like minority hate speech protection in our new criminal code. We have like a better animal rights protection in the new criminal code, and we get like a better abortion law, actually, at abortion and rape law in the new criminal code. But at the same time, the prison time and the fine for corruption is much lower. There's a lot of like invasion of privacy article that is very problematic. There's a lot of limiting of freedom of speech, like you're not allowed to insult the president or the government body. So there's just so many different conflicting agenda that I think that also plays a huge part on why a lot of people are reluctant to speak out. It's because they're confused. I think when a piece of legislation is clearly terrible, it's so easy for you to like speak out against it. Like, we hate this law, like we don't want it, like screw it or something like that. But or if there's like a piece of legislation that's very, very good, it's so easy to support it. But what do you do about like a piece of legislation that is just a mixed bag of so many different things? That's why sometimes people just gave up, because they have their own lives. They don't have time to like actually read that massive draft. And so there's definitely a lot of confusion. So it's really difficult to tell, like, how does the people respond to this new criminal code?
And I think that factor explains as well why the 2019 protest was so successful and why they didn't really occur again in 2022, is because in 2019, there was a clear message and demand. We want you to drop the revisions. Just drop it, right? It's quite clear and simple, just drop it.
And 2019 was mixed with the KPK
omnibus law as well, and the Corruption Eradication Commission law. But then now, when you have different activist groups saying, actually keep this, but we don't want this, and then another activist group going, actually this one's good, but we don't want that, it's just much harder to build a unified movement that can actually go against the government. So it is quite a difficult situation.
And I would say it's actually the government's tactic. Because like, if during the 2019, actually, part of what the student activists were campaigning for is also RUU PKS, or the sexual violence law, the anti-sexual violence law that Indonesia have been fighting over for a long time. And recently, before the criminal code, that law was ratified, but the article about rape was taken out from that law. So imagine an anti-sexual violence law without articles regulating rape. Why? Because the government said, oh, it's going to be regulated in our new criminal code. And so groups of women's rights activists and groups that support this law, now in order to get like a very, very good and comprehensive rape regulation, they need to support this new criminal code that is mixed with everything else. So there's a lot of like exchange and like mix and match, I would say, in that sense, that makes it even more complicated.
So we have another question from the YouTube Live where someone asked, do you think the criminal code could be changed in the future? So I assume that it would be like changed
Further
again
changes,
soon.
probably, yeah.
I think like some of it might be changed through judicial review, but again, like it's up to the constitutional court to like judge, and it'll be very difficult, I think, because to draft this new criminal code, it took us like how many years, like so long.
Yeah, I think it's important to mention like why this one made the news so much. Like, you know, laws get amended all the time, but not everything makes the news. So why this made the news was because it's the first revision of the criminal code since the Dutch colonial era, basically. The last time it was revised was in the 1800s, if I'm not wrong. 1800s, because the criminal code, it's based off the Dutch criminal code. Right, so that's why it was big, because it was actually the first time the criminal code's trying to be adjusted so that it's not colonial but based on traditional Indonesian values, is the argument that the government made. So there's no reason why the criminal code can't be changed again, but like Abigail said, it's going to be very difficult and it'll take a lot of political capital. You have to be a very brave and a very strong president to be able to do it. I think one of the reasons why Jokowi was brave enough to do it is because his approval ratings are so high, and they've been stably quite high for a very long time. But that's not common, right? So there's no reason why a future president won't try to change it again. But I think it will be a massive undertaking. To be fair, this was an act of the legislature. The president played a backseat role, if you ask me. He was quite ambivalent about it, right? He didn't really actively. In 2019, he even asked the asked the legislature just to stop discussions, right? So to be fair, it was the legislature. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there's nothing to stop a future legislature from doing it. So it wasn't really the president's undertaking. It's not fair to say that it was the president's undertaking.
Okay, so maybe as a final question or closing questions for our Q&A session, just in general, do you think it was covered correctly by the media, especially outside of Indonesia, or did they just focus on this code of premarital sex? Like, did they portray this change in the right way?
I think it's quite difficult, since there's a lot of like different base on what is the right or sufficient cover of this new criminal code, since again, like I mentioned, it's super massive. Like I wouldn't even categorize like WiWi's coverage of the new criminal code as like comprehensive or fair, because we didn't get to touch upon so many different articles and so many different like underlying messages or implication that it might have. But yes, there are a lot of like clickbaity media coverage that we saw, like I mentioned earlier, like the Bali sex ban, stuff like that. And to be fair, like I understand, because again, like even as an Indonesian, as like a person who read it, try to read it and like study it, it's still super hard to wrap my mind around it. Like I understand why foreign, like non-Indonesian media would try to cover it from that angle, because they need to make it relevant to their audience, right? Like if they start with like Indonesia has a new criminal code, I doubt that a lot of their readers would care, sadly. But I mean, it's true. So they try to make it like, of course, since the media is also like this, how we structure media is based on clicks and popularity. Of course, they're gonna try to use like the best headline. But what makes me sad actually is when a local news cover it by copy pasting from international media. And so they also like took that angle of like the sex ban kind of stuff. I think as a Indonesian news should do better, since they speak the language of the new criminal code and their readers are the people that are affected by the new criminal code.
So that was actually our last question for today.
Oh,
okay.
there's probably
Just got in. There's another question in the YouTube Live. So that is actually going to be the last question. Yes. So that question is, do you personally want to work in the government yourselves in the future?
Oh, I think this is like a great question for Hersey.
Oh no, no. Not in the Indonesian government. Yeah, I'm not Indonesian technically. But I think that's a really interesting question that a lot of youth grapple with who are really interested in politics and who want to change the country. I think it's a question of, if I enter the government, will I be able to clean it up, or will I get dirty in the process? Is, I think, something that it's a conflict and a tension and a paradox that a lot of Indonesian youth who care about government and politics in Indonesia feel. I go to university with a lot of Indonesian students who do care about politics, and when you and because I've studied politics and they study politics, a natural question is, do you want to enter politics? And that's something that, and it's something you hear all the time. It's like, I do, but I'm scared that I'll become dirty in the process and that I'll lose my idealism in the process and I'll just turn into any other politician, right? So I think there is that appetite to change Indonesia from within the government. But I think in saying that, there's also a very big fear that not only are they not going to be able to do it, but they might worsen it because they'll just become like any other corrupt Indonesian politician. So I think that's something that a lot of Indonesian youth grapple with.
For me, I actually worked in the government. I worked in the Jakarta governor office in the smart city division actually for almost a year. And then I quit due to like a combination of reasons. And now I think, since I've already had that experience and running What Is Up Indonesia, I think my role, I would play like a more strategic and effective role in doing most good through the media independently, compared to like if I were to go in and try to change the system from within or improve the system from within. Because I think for me personally, I don't have the capacity or like the quote unquote character that would be relevant, that would make me successful as a politician or as someone who is working in the government. But I think I would work better in the media or like independently by raising awareness, educating people, helping people to understand more, and like hopefully making them like make better decisions based on well-informed, because they're well-informed. But I do think that I've seen a lot of my friends whom I have a lot of respect for and I think are great. They're starting to like go in to the government of Indonesia, like maybe through the office of the president or like through a political party. And I think it is slow, but I can see that they are actually disrupting and improving a lot of things, although at like a very huge cost. But I think if someone were to want to go into the government and like go into politics, the most important thing I would say is to go in together with a lot of your friends who have the same idealism as you, because I think that support system is very important. And I'm not saying like it's impossible to like disrupt or improve the system from within, but it's just gonna be very, very long, incremental, and you need to have like a lot of stamina to do it. And I don't think I'm that person.
Okay, then that actually concludes our Q&A session, as that was the last question. So thank you so much, Hersey and Abby, for your time today. It was really interesting to talk to you about it, and I think I learned a lot. And I hope that all the people on YouTube like watching this have learned a lot too. And so that was it for today. Thank you.
Yeah.
And if you guys want to say anything else, then please feel free.
thank you for having us. It was a really interesting discussion, and we hope you guys continue your interest in Indonesia.
Yep, thank you. It was a very pleasant discussion, and wish you luck in your future collaboration and endeavor.